Hi there. I'm going to talk for a little bit about the purpose of the little magazine. I'm the editor of a magazine called The White Review. It's a little magazine, and when I say that it's a little magazine, I don't mean that to be a term of self-deprecation. I mean it instead to describe a very specific type of periodical that operates in a different way and to different ends than mainstream publications. I'm going to talk about the little magazine as a specific type of cultural institution, occupying its own particular space, filling its own particular role, serving a particular purpose. And serving the purpose, I suppose, actually, was very useful to hear Tika earlier talk about this post-commercial world, and maybe the little magazine is something that can fit quite neatly into that post-commercial space. The writer Adam Throwbot wrote a piece for our previous issue in which he considered the purpose of little magazines, such as The White Review. He's a much better writer than I am, so I'm just going to quote him at length. He said, "A magazine is an event. Its basic principle is collage, and the elements of that collage can be much more outlandish and wild and savage than the average single book, since a magazine can deal in varied forms. It can deal in varied lengths as well. It can use the celebrated to reflect on the less celebrated, and vice versa. A magazine is a kind of fun palace, which the reader can set up anywhere and take wherever she wants. A magazine is a show, something to be wandered through over time. It's a place designed by its editors, where the unique and solitary objects that are fictions and works of art are arranged in careful ways, and that arrangement makes them even more available and desirable to the passing literary fetishist." There are some ideas there that resonate very strongly, and I'll return to the idea of fetishism particularly, with my own convictions about the production and consumption of culture. But in the context of the discussion we're having here about hybridity and new economies, I want to consider two things particularly. The first is the little magazine is a fun palace, or a platform for dealing with varied forms. I think the little magazine is uniquely well placed to combine different forms. But I want to talk about the economic imperative for doing so. I want to talk about the problems inherent in that hybridity. Secondly, the little magazine exists on the margins. I want to consider that it occupies a specific space that I talked a little bit about, and fulfills a role different to that of its larger rivals. In the latter part of the talk, then, I'll consider the problems that arise when an institution that begins little grows. So it's probably worth outlining first a few of the reasons that we set up a little magazine, so that we might understand how those ideals are achieved, corrupted, neglected, or exposed as naive in the course of a magazine's growth. We, by which I mean myself and my co-founder and co-editor, Jacques Testard, founded The White Review in 2010. Our backgrounds are quite varied. I'd been working as an editor at the BBC on global news, and dabbling in the art world, I suppose. He'd been working at publishing houses in France and the US. There was something inescapably perverse, I suppose, about setting up a magazine 18 months after the financial crisis, and beyond that about 5 or 10 years into the disintegration of the traditional print publishing industry. Yet my prevailing feeling was, and remains, that it was an exciting time to be setting up something small, something little. The economic model by which the mainstream publishing industry operated, by which I mean established magazines and the larger presses, was breaking down. Spending on advertising in US print newspapers, for instance, halved between 2005 and 2009. In 2008, vast numbers of mid-ranking editorial staff were laid off at the big publishers. And there was Amazon as well, which Lucky PDF fortunately talked about earlier. I'd worked at the start of my career as an editor at a major academic publishing house, and I didn't like it at all. So I was actually quite pleased to see this crisis, irrespective of the damage it did to my own long-term prospects of making any money or getting a proper job. So whether rightly or wrongly, it felt that the crisis would clear the way for new things to happen, among them little magazines. But it's worth bearing in mind that the real catalyst for change in the publishing world didn't come from the protests of editors or writers or artists who were dissatisfied with the status quo. Instead, the industry changed because it couldn't accommodate a technological shift for which it had not made practical or ideological allowances. The shift from physical to digital content and online distribution shouldn't have come as a surprise, but the financial crisis brought the issue to a head. The major publishers and the presses and magazines they supported realised that the model they used was no longer supportable on the scale to which they're accustomed. Big magazines and big publishing houses seemed to be doomed. The general consensus was that they would not last very much longer. This seemed to open up space to little magazine, maybe even a space in which it could flourish in the absence of these traditional dominant institutions, precisely because of its littleness. The economic model that we adopted was therefore what you might call a hybrid model. Economically, we kept our costs down as much as we could. We had very low overheads. We all worked other jobs to keep it going. And we had a mixed revenue stream. We were financed through a combination of sales, subscriptions, and advertising, even though the advertising was much smaller than it would have been previously. We were supported by public funding. We set up as a charitable institution in the UK, and we're supported now by Arts Council England. And we also went out of our way to attract private donations through crowdfunding, incentivised giving. But there was another way in which we adopted a hybrid model, and it's that I'd like to talk a little bit about now. This type of hybridity was based upon engaging other sectors of the culture industry other than the one with which we were primarily engaged, which was literature. We were admirers when we set up the magazine of another recently founded magazine called Triple Canopy. The following quote is from that publication's manifesto, and I think quite neatly outlines what I mean by hybridity in terms of working with other sectors of the industry, or other sectors of culture, I should say. This is from Triple Canopy. Our model hinges on the development of publishing systems that incorporate networked forms of production and circulation. Working closely with artists, writers, technologists and designers, Triple Canopy produces projects that demand considered reading and viewing. Triple Canopy resists the atomization of culture and, through sustained inquiry and creative research, strives to enrich the public sphere. This commitment to resisting the atomization of culture is something that we shared with Triple Canopy. As I've said, our academic backgrounds were varied in literature, philosophy and history. This is the team that set it up I'm talking about. And we'd all worked in the art world, in journalism, in publishing. So all of these pursuits were of interest to us, and we felt that there wasn't anything of that broad and serious scope on offer in London. Magazines in London seemed to our eyes either specialist in their approach, like the London Review of Books, which otherwise I admire a great deal, or to engage with different forms in a somewhat superficial way. I'm thinking of the Frieze poetry issue, for example, which, while it's a good thing that it brought exposure to certain young poets, I think dealt with the entire sphere of poetry in something of a superficial way. These didn't seem to us like real hybrid models. They seemed like larger institutions taking advantage of the appeal of smaller pursuits. We wanted to make a magazine that was really multidisciplinary. I mean by that it would give equal weight to visual art, fiction, non-fiction, poetry, on a variety of themes in a variety of styles, and do proper justice to them all. Which was very utopian of us, and probably naive and stupid, but it was nonetheless the intention. And thinking about that utopian element and the stupidity of it and the naivety now, as it seems, I actually thought it'd be worth revisiting some of the things we said when we actually started the magazine, rather than things that I'm going to tell you now about what I thought then, which might be untrue. So I went back to some of the interviews we did when we started the magazine, and we were trying to drum up interest by any means possible. So the following quote is from an interview we did in Book Forum a few years ago, and we were asked very directly why we set up the magazine. To which I replied, "Our reasoning stemmed in part from the fact that it is difficult for young writers, and to a lesser degree artists, to have their work published in the UK. So we were attempting to fill a hole in the literary market by creating a serious quarterly journal in London. And we also wanted to do something new by bringing the different and sometimes separate fields of art and literature together. Last but not least, we wanted to design the magazine to make it visually striking and desirable as an object, because that's how we believe books will survive." Now, 4 years later, or whatever it is, what struck me about rereading that quote was the final sentence. Having said the rote things about bringing different forms together, which I always say, which we might call hybridity in this context, at the end of it all, I gave a different motivation than the one I might give now, or if I had a little bit more time to think about it. What I said specifically was that this hybrid model was necessary to help books survive. I didn't say that it reflected the way we engage with information now in the digital age, or that, like Triple Canopy, we wanted to resist the atomization of culture. Instead, I said very boldly that it was an effort to help books survive. So what I want to point out, and surprise myself, really, was that I wasn't giving an ideological reason for this, I was giving an economic one. So I wanted to consider, or to revisit, why I thought that that type of hybridity would be a viable strategy for survival in an industry that everyone thought was on the decline. And I wanted to interrogate that precise impulse, that desire to collaborate. Collaboration here is a means of propping up the dying industry, a way, again, of helping books survive. The new strategy, then, was effectively to co-opt the strategies of healthier industries, And the art world seemed, from the vantage of the publishing world, to be a much healthier industry. And I actually read this to someone in the art world before, and she laughed at me and said, how can you think that art world is remotely healthy? But I can promise you that from the position of publishers in 2008, it did seem healthy. There was money there, and people were staying in their jobs. There's a quick parallel that I just want to draw between the publishing and the visual art market here, just to illuminate why it seemed appealing. The economic crisis that struck commercial publishing didn't happen in the commercial art world. In spite of all the discourse around contemporary art and critique over the past 50 years, the commercial gallery system is thriving, long after the art object dematerialized. The dematerialization of the book, however, just fucked everything forever. No one had ever really had to consider the value of a book after mechanical reproduction. It was always assumed to reside in the content of what was being communicated, rather than any kind of investiture of aura in the physical object of the book. And actually the talk we've just heard about editions is very interesting, because one of the first things that publishers thought about was trying to limit editions, sell them for a lot more money. So yeah, no one had any plan B, no one in the publishing world had any plan B when that information became available by means other than those effectively controlled by publishers in the established networks of distribution. The publishing world still hasn't found an effective means of selling a non-physical object, nor indeed the physical object by digital means, as hard as it's tried. One of the reasons that publishing then is increasingly keen to associate with the visual arts is because it would like desperately for the book to acquire some of the fetishist value of the art object. The fact that the art world seems still able to sell physical objects in a digital age is something that the publishing world envies deeply. I should add that I don't have any problem with the fetishization of objects at all. Not books. I have loads of books. I don't read them. I'm sure I could have them on a Kindle, but I like having them around. So little magazines like mine look at the art world, and specifically the boom in art books and editions, as I was saying, that seem to sell very well at very high prices, and wonder how we can get a piece of that. And basically we can get a piece of it, we can try to, by co-opting some of its strategies, and by cooperating with the institutions in the art world. The word hybrid here, in the context of today's discussion, has been used to describe amalgam forms and new economic platforms, and it's a good word. I like it. I like the implication of mongrel qualities of intermixture, of different platforms operating independently being brought together by a single organising principle, as we just heard. It's a better word than collaboration, which I think is insipid at best and kind of sinister as well somehow. But in the context of the little magazine, I'd like briefly to consider another word that we might use, and that word is diversification. Forgive me if this sounds like a digression, but I grew up in the west coast of Ireland and in the West Midlands of England, both of which are very rural areas. I was surrounded by agriculture, another industry that was generally accepted to be in terminal decline. However, that decay was to some extent arrested by two substantial innovations that took place when I was young. The first was the provision of European subsidies to agriculture, and the second was called diversification. Diversification was a pretty broad revolution in the operations of an industry, in the way that it perceived itself and the way that it engaged with other parts of the economy. Farming was encouraged to survive by cannibalizing other, relatively thriving industries, most notably the business of tourism and leisure. Thus, farmers turned their pens into attractions, with groups of deprived urban school children bussed in to hug pigs and to get close to nature, or they converted outlying barns into boutique B&B places, or they allowed teenagers to ride quad bikes through their fields and crash them. But the point is that this diversification was driven by economic necessity, consequent upon the failure of an industry. Something like this is apparent in the efforts of little magazines, and the White Review's included here, to muscle in on the perceived commercial success of the visual art world and its broader appeal. It has not always been the case that publishing sought to engage with the visual arts. The literary establishment has traditionally been quite insular in its behaviour, certainly in the UK. And I think it's worth pointing out that it's only relatively recently there that the visual arts have come to occupy a central position in the cultural landscape. Only 25 years ago, contemporary art was a marginal pursuit. The audiences for new literature and music were vastly higher, and the industries operated largely independently of each other. Indeed, there was a period immediately after the war when publishing, its coffers swollen, could have chosen to help out its relatively impoverished cousins in culture, but no one at Penguin ever thought about sponsoring a programme of contemporary dance. And I wonder, in fact, why the art world does this, why we are so accustomed to the fact that different strains of culture, we experience them within the white walls of gallery institutions. There doesn't seem to be an economic imperative for it, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's probably a whole different conference, but it's something that interests me. From the perspective of a publisher, it can seem something akin to a kind of imperial programme. Arts, craft, design, dance, literature, theatre have to some extent been reduced to colonial outposts in an empire ruled over by the visual arts. My point is that the visual arts conducts its experiments in hybridity, diversification, collaboration, whatever we call it, from a position of relative strength. It doesn't seek a union to shore up its position as publishing does or agriculture, but rather to extend its hegemony. These relative strengths have ramifications for the way that different sectors bleed into each other, for the relationships of power between the respective participants in any hybrid form. The point I suppose I'm trying to make is that the relationship that marginal pursuits, in which I include avant-garde literature, and mainstream pursuits, in which we can now, I think, include contemporary art, resembles that between little and large institutions. The power lies with one. I mean, there are a couple of practical examples. Adam recently pointed out that there was the Luma Foundation hosted a Poetry 89 Plus event, which is great, and Kenneth Goldsmith was there and a lot of young poets. But I do think there's something problematic about the idea of a foundation of the side of Luma dealing with poets that young and exposing them in a way that isn't necessarily in their best interests. But we've done this. The White Review has done this. We collaborate with the ICA and the Serpentine. We've recently done something with the Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris. And we've held events at places like that across the world. It's a means by which we can reach a wider audience and promote the writers and artists that we're publishing. And it's an important responsibility of the Little magazine to try and achieve greater exposure for its contributors. It's a kind of an essential part of the unspoken contract between contributor and editor, that the Little magazine will peddle their wares on their behalf, will make their work available to as many people as possible. And of course, occasionally it's a very gratifying experience to bring, in some cases, relatively obscure writers to new readers by collaborating with institutions such as these is one of the rewards of running a Little magazine. But it can be problematic. Working with large institutions entails a shift away from the margins of production towards its centre. With that, you risk your independence. You might end up supporting a prevailing idea of culture that you initially set out to oppose. The question I want to ask here is, what happens when a Little magazine grows up? When it becomes, if not big, then at least medium-sized, if not old, at least adolescent or post-adolescent. So having described the idealistic origins of the Little magazine, I want to talk a little bit about the complications that arise in the course of running it, in the course of expanding it. I'll start here with a quote from a recent editorial in N+1, which is another magazine based in New York that we admire a lot, which sums up this issue, I think, probably more succinctly than I can. The Little magazine always originates as an image of utopia that it then betrays. It starts with love, but very little money, and because it is edited for free, mostly, it gets writing for free, mostly, in a non-exploitative way, since no one is extracting any surplus value. This is the utopian stage, where writing as a competitive enterprise, as a sphere rife with greed and envy, disappears. It is replaced by a pure and purely unnecessary, in the sense of not being directly useful to the reproduction of biological life and material needs, contemplation of essential, fundamental problems. That is to say, it becomes art. But then, almost immediately, the Little magazine becomes a way to graduate to the world of hackery. For its editors and writers to become journalists, novelists, overpaid business school speakers, and in this way can serve more as an instrument than an opponent of the hack world. In the early stages of starting a Little magazine, marginality is not a choice. Whether or not you want to be marginal, you just are, whether you're attacking or defending it. But the margins are a pretty good place to be. You can shout from the margins. You don't have any great responsibilities in the margins. You don't, for instance, have to be particularly consistent. You can take risks. You can make mistakes. And it's natural. The Little magazine should be on the margins, I think. But that desire to operate on the margins is pretty strongly counterweighted by the fear of being too marginal, so marginal that you go out of business, basically, or that no one listens to you. I mean, there are no guarantees when you start up, no real guarantees at all, actually, as you keep going, that what you're putting out won't just go unnoticed, and you have to work very hard constantly to make sure that people are listening. So that's the tension that I want to explore a little bit. One early means of resolving that tension is the employment of something like smoke and mirrors. It's possible for little magazines, like any small institution with a dedicated workforce, to paper over the cracks simply by working very hard. This early stage of amateurism is probably the most purely enjoyable period in a little magazine's lifetime for everyone involved. I mean amateur there, not in the sense of incompetence, but rather in the sense of a project undertaken for the love of it and for the passion of it, without any particular thought of remuneration. But as the little magazine grows, as its circulation rises and the bureaucratic tasks begin to outnumber the editorial, it becomes necessary to professionalise. Suddenly you have to run a budget, to administrate, to spend all of your time searching for funding. And all of this while supporting yourself by other jobs. So then we have to ask, not only what is the role of the little magazine in terms of the wider culture, but also what the purpose of the little magazine is in terms of work, the world of work. Now, I'm a firm believer in the responsibility of little magazines and small institutions generally to pay their contributors. I don't believe in the culture of free, and I think actually, post the financial crisis, the burgeoning movement towards the free distribution of artistic works has been pretty roundly defeated. We pay our contributors, not as much as I'd like, not as much as I think would accurately reflect the work that they're putting in. Not enough for the contributors to make a living, if they were reliant exclusively upon the revenue they can generate by writing full-time for the White Review, or for magazines like it. So, if we're asking people to devote their time to a project that will never provide them with a living, what does that mean in terms of their careers, in terms of their lives? And what does it mean, in fact, for the editorial staff at the magazine who work for free? The question I'm sidling up to here is, what's the point of a little magazine? Is it art, or is it work? If it's work, then we need more money, always. We need to make a dash for the centre, we need to professionalise further, we need to expand our readership and make editorial decisions based on that principle. We need a marketing budget, we need a dedicated advertising team, we need some big names to write about things that will appeal to a broader demographic. But if it's art, perhaps we can retreat further from the economic considerations of being an employer. Perhaps people will contribute for free, happy and secure in the idea that their expressions are reaching an audience, that they are creating intellectual and aesthetic connections between people, that they are creating culture. But neither of those seem quite satisfactory to me. I suppose at risk of taking the easy way out, I'd contend that a little magazine is both art and work. It is neither exclusively, neither completely. This combination is part of what defines a little magazine. Let me unpack that just a little bit. By saying that it's art, I'm adopting the definition provided by N+1 in the earlier quote, namely, a pure and purely unnecessary contemplation of essential, fundamental problems. The editorial line of a little magazine is not, or should not be, driven by the need to appease advertisers or to draw in a mainstream audience. That means it can give its contributors the opportunity to consider, at the length they consider appropriate, important issues, whether or not those issues are likely to attract new readers. I think that's really important. On the other hand, I do, as I said before, believe in the possibility of writing as a profession. Little magazines cannot on their own provide a sustainable career, but they can be part of a mixed portfolio. For professional writers, little magazines can serve a purpose equivalent to a musician's side project. They can be a place to experiment away from the relative glare of the mainstream. They can be a place in which to develop and realise new ideas that might alienate a broader audience, and damage their own careers, in fact. By contrast, emerging writers can use the little magazine to advance their careers. Publications such as the White Review are read by editors of more prestigious, better funded magazines who are looking for new writing. And I suppose in that respect we can be a stepping stone. Indeed, most of the writers who write for the big, well-paid periodicals, Harper's or the New Yorker, began with little magazines. So it's a springboard, potentially, a proving ground, if the writer wants to use it as such. I don't have any objection to that, particularly. I don't have any objection that the White Review should be used in an instrumental fashion by its contributors. I don't want to impose an artificial sense of purity upon the venture. When coming to editorial decisions, we don't consider the contributors' motivation. We don't think what they're trying to achieve or if they have an end goal. We just consider each piece on its merit. Alternatively, of course, the writer can choose to remain an enthusiastic amateur. And again, I mean that in the best possible way. She can continue to work part-time or indeed full-time writing because it's a form of art, it's a means of expression. I mean, there are many great writers who did that. So what I want to say really is that the little magazine can provide a kind of bullock between between the writer and the commercial pressures, or the general pressures of trying to make a living. We're all conscious in this age of the kind of exploitative internship of the quandary of surplus value against economic capital. But I think that the little magazine and other small institutions can plot a way between these poles by returning the power to choose what they're doing to its participants. Contributors should be able to use the institution for their own ends, to pursue the path they have chosen, rather than the institution exploiting its contributors. The little magazine exists to protect writers from those commercial imperatives, neither to pay them so little as to be exploitative, nor to pay them so much that it becomes commercially viable to make a living through those means, and so that money drives the decisions they're making when they're writing. The little magazine is a space in which contributors can do what they choose. They can use it as a shop window, they can use it as a space in which to experiment, they can try things they might not dare to elsewhere. The little magazine should respect that as part of the contract. The little magazine, then, is a hybrid. It occupies a very particular position. It's not so much on the margins, in fact, as in between. It's between surplus value and cultural capital, and more than that, the little magazine is between work and art. Thank you.